every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. There is a profound, unspoken vulnerability in air travel that we all collectively agree to ignore. When we step onto a commercial airliner, we place our fragile bodies inside a pressurized metal tube, trusting our lives to invisible radio frequencies, complex hydraulic systems, and the steady hands of strangers. We fly over vast, inhospitable stretches of the earth, suspended miles above the surface, believing completely in the tether that connects us to the ground. That tether is made of radar, satellite communication, and constant vigilance. But what happens when that tether is intentionally severed? What happens when a modern technological marvel, heavily monitored and tracked by multiple international agencies, simply slips off the map? Today, we dissect the anatomy of an aviation void. We will examine the forensic ghosts left behind by Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. This is not just a story of a lost airplane. It is an exhaustive study of digital forensics, the complex psychology of isolation, and the terrifying realization that even in our hyper-connected modern world, it is still possible to completely disappear. We will tear down the timeline, dissect the satellite handshakes that redefined global search and rescue, analyze the terrifying theories of human intervention versus catastrophic failure, and explore the psychological devastation wrought by a crime scene that does not exist. To understand the sheer impossibility of this void, we must first understand the machine at the center of it. The aircraft was a Boeing 777-200, registered as 9 million Mauritanian Uguiyas. In the aviation industry, the 777 is a legend. It is heavily relied upon by major airlines for its exceptional safety record, its massive twin engines, and its redundancy. Redundancy is the philosophy of modern aviation engineering. If one system fails, another independent system takes its place. If a communication channel goes dark, another is transmitting on a different frequency. A 777 does not simply vanish because a single wire short-circuits. It is designed to broadcast its existence continuously. On the evening of March 7, 2014, this massive aircraft sat on the tarmac at Kuala Lumpur International Airport. It was scheduled for a routine red-eye flight, designated MH370, bound for Beijing Capital International Airport. The flight would take approximately 5.5 hours, crossing the Gulf of Thailand, the South China Sea, and the airspace of Vietnam before cutting north into China. Boarding the aircraft were 227 passengers from 15 different nations. The demographic was largely Chinese citizens returning home, along with Malaysians, Indonesians, Australians, Indians, French, and Americans. They were families returning from vacation, artists traveling to an exhibition in Beijing, engineers, students, and young couples. It was a completely unremarkable cross-section of global humanity settling into their seats, adjusting their air vents, and preparing to sleep through the night. In the cockpit sat two men responsible for their lives. The captain was 53-year-old Zahari Ahmad Shah. He was an incredibly experienced aviator, a veteran of Malaysia Airlines who had joined the company in 1981. He possessed over 18,000 hours of flight time. He was an aviation enthusiast who had even built an intricate Microsoft flight simulator setup in his own home. He was a married father of 3, well respected by his peers, and an examiner authorized by the Malaysian Civil Aviation Authority to conduct simulator tests for other pilots. Beside him, in the right seat, was First Officer Fariq Abdul Hamid. He was 27 years old and had joined the airline in 2007. He had 2,700 flight hours and was currently transitioning to the Boeing 777. In fact, this was his final training flight on this specific aircraft type, and Captain Zahari was acting as his evaluator. Farik was engaged to be married to a fellow pilot from another airline. On paper, this was a highly competent, stable crew. At 12:41 in the morning on March 8, local time, Flight 370 was cleared for takeoff. The twin Rolls-Royce engines roared to life, pushing the 300 aircraft down the runway and into the humid night sky. For the first 38 minutes, the flight was absolutely textbook. The aircraft climbed to its assigned cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The weather was clear. The air traffic controllers in Subang, Malaysia, tracked the bright blip on their secondary radar screens. To understand what happened next, we must dissect the anatomy of aircraft communication. An airplane like the 777 communicates its location and status in several ways. First is the primary radar, which is the classic radio wave system. A dish on the ground bounces a wave off the metal skin of the plane, calculating its distance and bearing. Second is the secondary surveillance radar. This relies on an instrument inside the plane called a transponder. When the transponder receives a signal from the ground, it actively replies, squawking a unique 4-digit code along with the plane's exact altitude. This is what air traffic controllers rely on. Third is the Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, known as ACARS. This is essentially a digital data link system that transmits automated text-based messages between the aircraft and ground stations. It monitors the health of the engines, the fuel levels, and dozens of operational parameters. It sends these data bursts via VHF radio or via satellite when the plane is over the ocean. At 1:01 in the morning, the ACARS system transmitted a routine data report. Everything was normal. At 1:07, the final ACARS message was sent. The system was scheduled to send another report 30 minutes later, at 1:37. That transmission would never arrive. At 1:19 in the morning, Flight 370 approached a navigational waypoint known as IGARI, located over the Gulf of Thailand. This waypoint marks the boundary between Malaysian airspace and Vietnamese airspace. The Malaysian air traffic controller radioed the cockpit, instructing them to contact Ho Chi Minh City Air Traffic Control. The voice that replied is believed to be that of Captain Zahari. He said, "Good night, Malaysian 370. His tone was calm, relaxed, and entirely routine. There was no tremor of fear, no sound of a struggle in the background, no indication whatsoever of a mechanical anomaly." 2 minutes later, at 1:21 in the morning, as the aircraft crossed waypoint IGARI, the transponder on Flight 370 stopped transmitting. It did not fade out slowly. It was cut off abruptly. On the radar screens in Subang, the data block containing the flight number, altitude, and speed simply vanished. It is highly unusual for a transponder to fail completely without prior warning, but it is incredibly easy for a pilot to turn it off. It requires only the turn of a dial in the cockpit. Simultaneously, the ACARS system was disabled. Whether it was shut down prior to the 119 radio call or immediately after remains a point of intense forensic debate, as the system does not announce its own shutdown. It simply stops sending data at the next scheduled interval. Within seconds, Flight 370 had become electronically invisible to civilian air traffic control. When Ho Chi Minh City Control noticed the plane had not checked in, they spent several crucial minutes trying to raise the aircraft on the radio. They contacted Kuala Lumpur. Confusion set in. The protocol for a missing aircraft is strict, but in the early hours of the morning, amid the disbelief that a modern airliner could just disappear, the response was agonizingly slow. It took hours for a full-scale emergency to be declared, and a search and rescue operation to be initiated in the South China Sea. But while the civilian controllers stared at empty screens, a different kind of radar was watching. Military primary radar, which does not rely on the cooperative transponder signal, picked up an unidentified track. It took days for the Malaysian military to process and release this data, but when they did, it fundamentally changed the anatomy of the investigation. The military radar showed that immediately after the transponder was disabled at waypoint IGARI, the aircraft performed a sharp, unannounced turn to the right, and then a sweeping turn to the left, heading back southwest toward the Malay Peninsula. This was not a slow, drifting deviation that might suggest an unconscious crew. This was a deliberate, tightly executed turn that pushed the aircraft to the limits of its aerodynamic envelope. The radar track showed the ghost plane flying back across mainland Malaysia, passing near the city of Penang, Captain Zahari's hometown. It flew out over the Strait of Malacca. Furthermore, the flight path was not random. The radar blip navigated precisely from waypoint to waypoint. It flew to waypoint Vampi, then Mekar, following established aviation corridors used by commercial traffic. This required someone in the cockpit to actively input these commands into the flight management computer, or physically fly the plane using the autopilot heading bug. This was a navigated flight, actively piloted by someone with intimate knowledge of regional aviation routes. At 2:22 in the morning, the military radar track lost the aircraft as it flew beyond its range, heading northwest over the Andaman Sea. At that moment, Flight 370 vanished from the final terrestrial sensor capable of seeing it. The world believed the plane was gone without a trace. The authorities scoured the South China Sea, acting on the initial point of communication loss, wasting critical days, looking in the entirely wrong ocean. But the Boeing 777 is a persistent machine. Even with the transponder off and the ACARS system disabled, a separate, deeply embedded terminal remained active. This was the satellite data unit, which communicates with the global Inmarsat satellite network. This unit is designed to log onto the network, essentially saying, "I am here and I am awake," in case the airline needs to send a text message or place a satellite phone call to the cockpit. Every hour, if the satellite has not heard from the aircraft, the ground station sends an automated interrogation signal, commonly called a ping. The aircraft's satellite unit automatically replies with a handshake. These handshakes do not contain GPS coordinates. They do not contain altitude, speed, or heading. They are simply electronic acknowledgments, a digital pulse in the dark. Days into the disappearance, engineers at the British satellite company Inmarsat realized they had these handshake logs in their database. There were 7 handshakes recorded after the plane disappeared from military radar. The final handshake occurred at 8:19 in the morning. This meant that Flight 370 had continued to fly for almost 6 hours after it vanished from the radar screens. It meant the plane had not crashed in the Strait of Malacca. It had flown until it exhausted its fuel supply. This revelation birthed the most complex digital forensic investigation in aviation history. How do you find an airplane in the middle of nowhere, using only 7 blank data pings? The Inmarsat scientists had to invent a completely new way of analyzing satellite data. They looked at 2 incredibly obscure metadata metrics attached to these handshakes. The first metric was the burst timing offset, or BTO. The satellite knows exactly when it sends a ping, and it records exactly when the reply arrives. By calculating the delay down to the microsecond, and knowing the speed of light, the scientists could determine the exact distance between the satellite and the airplane at the moment of each handshake. Because the satellite is positioned high above the equator, a specific distance translates to a circle on the Earth's surface. Think of it like drawing a ring around the satellite's position. The plane could be anywhere on that ring. With 7 handshakes, they had 7 expanding rings. This created 2 possible flight corridors. A northern corridor stretching from Thailand up towards Kazakhstan, and a southern corridor stretching deep into the remote Indian Ocean. The northern corridor crossed over heavily militarized zones with highly advanced air defense radar systems in India, Pakistan, and China. It is practically impossible for a massive commercial jetliner to fly through those airspace undetected without triggering alarms or interceptor jets. Therefore, the southern corridor became the primary focus. But where on that vast southern arc did the plane end up? To answer this, Inmarsat utilized a second, even more complex metric called the burst frequency offset, or BFO. This relies on the Doppler effect. Think of an ambulance siren changing pitch as it drives past you. Radio waves do the same thing. If the airplane is moving towards the satellite, the frequency of the handshake signal is slightly compressed. If it is moving away, the frequency is slightly stretched. By analyzing the minute distortions in the radio frequency of the handshakes and comparing them to known flight paths of other 777s, the Inmarsat engineers could determine the relative direction of the aircraft. The math was staggering. They had to account for the movement of the plane, the slight wobble of the satellite in its orbit, and the rotation of the Earth itself. The BFO data provided a definitive, chilling conclusion. The aircraft was not flying north, it was flying south, fast and straight. For hours, Flight 370 flew into the most desolate, unforgiving expanse of water on the planet, the southern Indian Ocean, a place far from any emergency landing strip, far from shipping lanes, and devoid of islands. It was a flight path to nowhere. At 8:19 in the morning, the final handshake was recorded. Interestingly, this handshake was initiated by the aircraft, not the ground station. Forensic analysis suggests that this was a logon request. The most plausible explanation is that the massive 777 had finally run out of aviation fuel. As the main engines flamed out, the primary generators died. The aircraft lost electrical power. As it began to glide toward the ocean, a small emergency propeller, called the ram air turbine, automatically deployed from the belly of the plane to provide critical electrical power to the flight instruments. When this backup power kicked in, the satellite data unit rebooted and sent that final, desperate logon request. Shortly after that transmission, Flight 370 hit the water. The search that followed was the most expensive and expansive in human history. It shifted from the warm, shallow waters of the South China Sea to the roaring 40s, a region of the Indian Ocean notorious for brutal winds, towering waves, and relentless storms. An international armada of ships and aircraft scoured the surface for any sign of an oil slick, a floating seat cushion, or a life jacket. For weeks, the families of the passengers existed in a state of agonizing limbo. The psychology of this event is a crucial part of its anatomy. Psychologists refer to this condition as ambiguous loss. It is a profound, unresolved grief that occurs when there is no body, no wreckage, and no definitive proof of death. The families were trapped between hope and mourning, subjected to a daily barrage of false leads, unverified radar blips, and media speculation. Every piece of ocean garbage spotted by a satellite was briefly elevated to the status of a clue, only to be dismissed hours later, plunging the families back into despair. When the surface search yielded absolutely nothing, the operation moved beneath the waves. The investigators had to define a search area based on the intersection of the final satellite handshake ring and the estimated flight dynamics of a Boeing 777 gliding without power. They mapped an area of the seafloor the size of Pennsylvania, an environment completely unmapped by humanity until that moment. They deployed deepwater autonomous underwater vehicles, like the Bluefin 21, utilizing side-scan sonar to peer through the pitch-black, freezing depths. Searching mountains and trenches miles beneath the surface, they were looking for the distinct angular shapes of an engine cowling or the debris field of a shattered fuselage. For nearly 3 years, ships dragged sonar arrays back and forth across this desolate underwater landscape, mowing the lawn in the dark. They found shipwrecks from the 19th century. They found geological anomalies, but they did not find a single trace of Flight 370. In the absence of a crime scene, nature eventually provided the only physical evidence. In July 2015, more than a year after the disappearance, a man cleaning a beach on Reunion Island, a French territory in the western Indian Ocean, found a large piece of debris covered in goose barnacles. Marine biologists and aviation experts converged on the artifact. It was a flaperon, a control surface from the trailing edge of a Boeing 777 wing. The serial numbers matched. It was the first undeniable proof that MH370 had violently met its end in the ocean. Over the next few years, more pieces washed ashore along the coasts of Madagascar, Mozambique, and South Africa, pieces of the engine cowling, interior cabin panels, and a section of the right outboard flap. The anatomy of these shattered fragments tells a violent story. The damage to the trailing edge of the flaperon suggested it was not deployed in a landing configuration when it hit the water. This heavily implies that the aircraft was not brought down in a controlled, gentle ditching attempt, but rather slammed into the ocean at a high rate of speed in an uncontrolled dive, shattering upon impact. But these pieces of debris, while confirming the aircraft's fate, could not explain the human element. They could not answer the why. This brings us to the most disturbing and contentious part of our dissection: the theories of human involvement versus mechanical failure. We must first look at the mechanical failure theories. The most prominent hypothesis suggests a massive catastrophic event that incapacitated the crew but left the aircraft structurally intact enough to fly on autopilot until fuel exhaustion. This theory often centers on a rapid decompression event. If the fuselage lost pressure at 35,000 feet, the pilots would have seconds of useful consciousness to don their oxygen masks. If they failed to do so, they would succumb to hypoxia, a terrifying condition where the brain is starved of oxygen, leading to confusion, euphoria, and eventually unconsciousness. Proponents of this theory point to a cargo manifest that included a large shipment of lithium-ion batteries. These batteries have a known history of thermal runaway, potentially causing fierce, uncontrollable fires. A fire in the electronics bay could theoretically disable the transponder and ACARS, while filling the cockpit with toxic smoke, forcing the pilots to turn the aircraft back toward the nearest airport in a desperate attempt to land. Under this theory, the pilots input a return course into the autopilot, but passed out from smoke inhalation or hypoxia before they could begin a descent. The plane, flying as a ghost ship filled with deceased passengers, simply continued on its last programmed heading into the southern Indian Ocean. However, the catastrophic failure theory struggles to explain the precise, navigated turns at the waypoints in the Strait of Malacca. A ghost plane does not actively steer itself from waypoint to waypoint for over an hour, a fire severe enough to disable multiple redundant communication systems without destroying the flight control computers, while allowing the plane to fly for another 6 hours, is a combination of events so statistically improbable that many aviation experts discard it completely. This forces us to confront the darkest and most widely accepted theory among independent investigators and many aviation professionals: deliberate human action. This theory posits that someone in the cockpit, intimately familiar with the Boeing 777 systems, intentionally hijacked the aircraft. Early in the investigation, suspicions fell upon 2 Iranian passengers traveling on stolen European passports. The media seized on the idea of state-sponsored terrorism. However, international intelligence agencies quickly determined these men were asylum seekers trying to reach Europe, not terrorists. No terror group has ever claimed credible responsibility for MH370, an anomaly in an era where extremist groups eagerly claim credit for aviation disasters. If it was not an external hijacking, the focus inevitably turns inward, to the men flying the plane. While First Officer Farik was young and lacked the deep technical knowledge to disable the aircraft's communication nodes so flawlessly, Captain Zahari possessed the exact skill set required. The deliberate action theory suggests a chilling sequence of events. At 1:19 in the morning, Captain Zahari bids goodnight to Malaysian air traffic control. Sometime around this moment, he locks his young co-pilot out of the cockpit, perhaps sending him back into the cabin on a contrived errand. Zahari then manually reaches down and switches off the transponder. He disables the ACARS reporting system. He takes manual control of the aircraft and executes the sharp turn back across the Malay Peninsula. The most disturbing aspect of this theory is the method of silencing the passengers. Aviation experts theorize that Zahari may have intentionally depressurized the cabin. In a commercial airliner, if the cabin altitude exceeds 14,000 feet, rubber oxygen masks automatically drop from the ceiling in the passenger cabin. These masks provide approximately 15 minutes of chemical oxygen. If the pilot climbed the aircraft to 40,000 feet and maintained that altitude, the passenger's oxygen would quickly deplete. Within 20 minutes, the 227 passengers and the cabin crew would succumb to hypoxia and silently pass away in their seats. The pilot, however, has access to a dedicated high-pressure oxygen system in the cockpit that can last for hours. In this grim scenario, Zahari ensures no one in the cabin can interfere or use their cell phones to call for help when the plane flies low over Penang. He essentially turns the aircraft into a flying tomb, navigates out over the Andaman Sea, and then turns south, flying into the darkness of the Indian Ocean until the fuel runs dry. What could possibly drive a successful, respected captain to commit mass murder? The Malaysian authorities conducted an exhaustive background check on Zahari. Officially, they found no financial distress, no extreme political affiliations, and no overt signs of mental illness. He was described by family as a loving father. However, leaked FBI documents regarding the forensic analysis of Zahari's home flight simulator painted a far more complicated picture. Investigators recovered deleted data from the simulator's hard drive. Weeks before the actual flight, Zahari had simulated a flight path that took off from Kuala Lumpur, flew out over the Strait of Malacca, and then turned south, flying deep into the remote southern Indian Ocean until it ran out of fuel. The simulated path was not identical to the exact route derived from the Inmarsat data, but the geographic destination, a desolate stretch of ocean with no airports, was chillingly identical. The Malaysian government's final report stated they could not determine the cause of the disappearance, leaving the conclusion officially open. They acknowledged the plane was manually turned off course, but refused to lay definitive blame on the captain, citing a lack of physical evidence from the cockpit voice recorder, which remains lost at the bottom of the sea. The disappearance of MH370 exposes a terrifying flaw in the anatomy of modern oversight. We have built systems that track our every digital move, yet we allowed a 300-ton machine carrying 239 souls to find a blind spot and vanish. We are forced to accept that despite our satellites, our radar, and our complex forensic mathematics, the ocean is vast, and human intent can be impenetrable. The wreckage of Flight 370 rests in the freezing, crushing depths of an underwater mountain range, holding the final answers tightly in its shattered metal. Until the black boxes are recovered, the narrative remains incomplete, a forensic puzzle with the centerpiece removed. The families are left with an agonizing void, staring out at the ocean, knowing that the greatest mystery of the modern age is not about a machine that failed, but about the terrifying, unfathomable darkness that can exist within the human mind. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.